and the star of the show, of course, brother and sister side boosters landing. I was excited.
Starship will be able to carry 1,000 passengers from Sydney to Dubai in just 40 minutes.
And Starman. Starman did not steal the show, though. The boosters did.
The largest mainstream passenger airplane today, the Airbus A380, can carry up to 853 passengers. However, that same route will take you 13 hours and 35 minutes to complete.
How did you end up an engineer and president of SpaceX?
So it currently is on Earth, but this is basically space travel for Earthlings. I can't wait for this residual capability. Basically, we're going to do is we're going to fly BFR like an aircraft and do point-to-point travel on Earth.
In other words, in the same time that it takes one Airbus A380 to travel from Sydney to Dubai, Starship can transport over 20 Airbus A380s worth of passengers.
So you can take off from New York City or Vancouver and fly halfway across the globe. You'll be on the BFR for roughly half an hour or 40 minutes. And the longest part of that, yeah, it's so awesome. The longest part of that flight is actually the boat out and back.
Which is over 20,000 passengers. So here's how much these tickets will cost and how Starship will make long-distance aviation obsolete.
I mean, Gwen, come on, this is awesome, but it's crazy, right? Like, this is never going to actually happen.
Oh no, it's definitely going to happen. This is definitely going to happen.
How? Like, what? I mean, so you really believe this is going to be deployed at some point in our amazing future? When? When do you...
Within a decade, for sure.
Yep, that's the president and chief engineering officer of SpaceX.
How did you end up an engineer and president of SpaceX?
Telling us that we're going to be flying these rocket-like planes within 10 years. And that was put up about 3 years ago now. But there must be lots of advantages to flying rockets-like planes, right?
So the first ship, the first BFR, is going to have roughly 100 passengers. And let's talk a little bit about the business. Everyone thinks rockets are really expensive, and to a large degree they are. And how could we possibly compete with airline tickets here?
Yeah, I'm kind of interested in that myself, because Elon Musk's rockets, just like airplanes, burn fossil fuels.
At the same time, SpaceX can take advantage of economies of scale to reduce their net profit margin. Instead of profiting $1 million per launch from a few dozen Starships, they can profit $250,000 per launch from hundreds of Starships.
So airplanes essentially burn kerosene, whereas Elon Musk's rockets burn methane, but chemically they're virtually identical.
But if you think about it, if I can do this trip in half an hour to an hour, I can do dozens of these a day, right? And yet a long-haul aircraft can only make one of those flights a day. So even if my rocket was slightly more expensive and the fuel is a little bit more expensive, I can run 10x at least what they're running in a day and really make the revenue that I need to out of that system.
What? Your business model here is to burn 10 times as much fossil fuel as the airline industry currently burns. And this is assuming that your rockets are going to get the same mileage, as it were, as planes do. Spoiler alert, we'll come on to this later. They don't get anywhere near, and will never be able to get anywhere near.
That's okay. That's certainly amazing.
I'm personally invested in this one because I travel a lot and I do not love to travel. And I would love to get to see my customers in Riyadh leave in the morning and be back in time to make dinner.
Seriously? You want to burn 10 times more fossil fuel so your customers in Riyadh on the other side of the planet can be home for dinner? Have you considered Zoom? Perspective time. Your average person, just by being alive, breathes out about half a ton of carbon dioxide per year. It's several times your own body weight of carbon dioxide is how much you breathe out per year. A first world lifestyle generates about 10 tons of carbon dioxide. Now, a single long-haul plane flight will generate about 1 ton of carbon dioxide, so a round trip, 2 tons, that sort of thing. So even assuming these rockets get comparable mileage per person as planes do, she's talking about generating 20% extra carbon dioxide for each one of their passengers so they can be home for dinner?
And I would love to get to see my customers in Riyadh leave in the morning and be back in time to make dinner.
So we're going to test. So within 10 years, an economy price ticket, or like a couple $1,000
Yes.
per person to
Yes.
fly New York to Shanghai.
Yeah, I think it'd be between economy and business.
Now, a lot of people will say that Elon Musk has completely revolutionized spaceflight. I mean, landing rockets like this is amazing. Certainly, no one has done anything like this before. And the same is true of reusability. No one had even thought of the concept of reusability in spaceflight until Elon Musk thought of it. And he did all of this while still having enough free time to invent the electric car, the Hyperloop, and the tunnel. And of course, no one has ever put an electric car into space before. That is an absolute first. Except, no. People were driving electric cars on the surface of the moon before I was even born. The whole idea of the shuttle program was rapidly reusable space vehicles. And landing the rocket vertically, well, that was kind of how it was done on the moon, which again was before I was even born. But even if you ignore that, the DCX program was doing that stuff with rapidly reusable vehicles some 20 years ago. In fact, a cynical man might look at the Starship and say, something familiar about all of this. Something old. Really, really old.
The first method we call direct ascent. You build an enormous rocket, put a capsule on top, boom, you go straight to the moon. The other method we call Earth Orbit Rendezvous.
You take a cargo ship full of fuel or a fuel depot, put it on that booster, get that in orbit, do a docking maneuver, refuel the spaceship.
We put the pieces together in orbit.
And either way we go, the spacecraft that lands on the moon is going to look like that.
Yes, just like that.
Yep, the original way of going to the moon was something called direct ascent. Now, the design has some obvious disadvantages. It's got a very high center of gravity, and you might not have that flatter landing site on the moon. And then, of course, once you've landed, if you can land, how do you get out of it?
Back in 1916, he realized something that we seem to have forgotten today. Getting to the moon, it's going to be all about weight. Look at the size of this thing. It's got to be 60, 70 feet tall, a couple of 100 tons at least. Do you really need to take all that to the surface? No.
Let's see. Starship. Dry mass is 100 tons. So with a bit of fuel, yeah, a couple of 100 tons. And height, a little more than 60 or 70 feet, more like 160 feet.
What I wonder is, what if you took along a smaller vehicle, lightweight, that you just used to land? Something like this.
Let's see. The lunar module was about 5 tons, with fuel about 15 tons. And the bit that actually blasted off from the moon, the ascent module, weighed about 5 tons. 2 tons having burnt off all the fuel, which means that since it took 2 people, at about 100 kilos apiece, by the time it had burnt off its fuel, about 10% of the weight of the ascent module was people.
That means you'd have to have a rendezvous between the two of them in lunar orbit.
Exactly.
And that's where it got kind of tricky, because that's actually pretty difficult to do.
Tom, we don't even know if rendezvous is possible in Earth orbit. And you want to do it around the moon? But wouldn't that be kind of dangerous?
I don't know. Would it?
And at the time, yes, it was impossible. You know, finding another tiny little craft in orbit that's traveling at about 10 times the speed of a bullet, and you've got to dock with it, otherwise you die. However, primarily this was a navigation problem, not a rocketry problem. One that was eventually solved by a rudimentary, well, at least by modern standards, what is a rudimentary computer on the lunar module. Now, this was no small feat, given at the time man first walked on the moon, he didn't even have a digital watch, but a mechanical one. And of course, the whole thing wasn't streamed in 4K. Otherwise, people might just be a little bit less impressed by stuff like this.
The moon was nothing compared to my view of home planet. It was it. It was the main chance. I'd look out the window, and there it would be, a tiny little thing. You could obscure it with your...
Collins remained in the Apollo command module orbiting the moon.
Like you got a fine-looking flying machine there, Eagle, despite the fact you're upside down.
The engine to propel them off the lunar surface was a huge exception to NASA's design philosophy of redundant systems.
Everything revolved around reliability. All of the Apollo burns around the moon were done with pressure-fed engines.
It was a solitary single, one chamber. That chamber either ignited properly and got you the thrust, or it did not. If it did not, Neil and Buzz were dead on the surface.
Because there was no backup on those. If for any reason those engines didn't work, everyone died. So with a pressure-fed engine, all you've got to do is successfully open the valves and the engine works. Now, all of Elon Musk's rocket engines use turbopumps to pump the fuel into the engines, which is great for efficiency. But the high flow rate, high pressure of those pumps is basically the entire reason why rocket science has its reputation. These are the reasons no one has really ever cracked launch failures, and to this day they linger in the 1 to 5% region, and that is after over a century of fuel pump research. Wiki kind of accurately describes the problem as turbopumps in rockets are important and problematic enough that launch vehicles using one have been caustically described as a turbopump with a rocket attached. Which, if you think about it, yeah, what else is there to a rocket other than a giant fuel tank and a combustion nozzle? So yeah, virtually the entire of the Apollo mission was designed around minimizing the places where a single point failure would kill everyone. And in places where there were no other alternatives, no backups, you went for the most reliable engine that you could, which is the gas pressure fed engine. No fuel pumps. All of Elon Musk's engines run on fuel pumps, and there is no emergency abort system. A single point failure on the booster stage, and the entire rocket and its crew is lost. This just wasn't true with Apollo. They had this very simple but effective system where wires ran the length of the rocket, and if there was a break in the connectivity on two of those wires, it was assumed that the rocket had disintegrated and the emergency abort system would be triggered, with maybe the most famous test of this being the Little Joe rocket, which was meant to simulate a rocket failure, which it did very effectively, because the rocket failed. And as it actually disintegrated, the mechanism fired and took the capsule to safety. This was not planned, that the rocket was going to disintegrate like this. But a notable exception here was the space shuttle, which compromised safety for reusability. If you want to reuse those engines have to be off on the side of the launch vehicle, and that limits your abort options. But with Elon Musk's rocket, it's not just that a single point failure on the first stage will cause the loss of the entire vehicle and its crew. The same is also true of the second stage. There is no abort system. These are far from trivial problems. I'm not aware of anyone in the entire of spaceflight who's lit up a turbopump engine after an extended period of time in space. All of the engines that go on spacecraft that go through deep space and have months before they have to fire again are pressure-fed engines that use hypergolic propellants that ignite spontaneously. And I think the problem with that is, just to do the tests, will these turbopumps fire successfully after they've been sat in deep space for, the 6th month's travel to Mars or something? You have to worry about things like lubricants evaporating out of the engine or stuff freezing in the engine and so forth. But it does kind of bug me that Elon Musk fans dance a jig like he's just turned water into wine when he replicates something that people did over 50 years ago, like take men up to dock with a space station. It's not just that people were doing it 50 years ago. They were doing that sort of thing around the moon.
Within this strange ship, 2 astronauts and a treasure. Triple-sealed vacuum boxes of rocks and soil from the surface of the moon. Locked within these rocks were secrets of the ages to be studied and deciphered by the scientists of Earth.
And Starman. Starman did not steal the show, though. The boosters did.
Yes, this would be amazingly impressive if only people hadn't walked on the surface of the moon before Elon Musk was even born.
Here, men from the planet Earth, first set foot upon the moon, July 1969, AD. He came in deep.
For 30 times he saw the Earth rise over the horizon of the moon.
Yeah, this probably would have got more people excited if it was streamed in 4K. You know, not filmed in shaky cam. But in many ways, this highlights the real problem. Since we walked on the moon, digital video has gone from this...
I guess you're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the scene. That's all right, I don't mind a bit.
...to this.
And Starman.
Meanwhile, rocket reliability over the same period has gone from about 5% failure to 1 or 2% failure. It's not got easier to make rockets over this time. Now, don't get me wrong, space is always difficult, and just to get men into orbit is no trivial task. But it's not exactly something new. These are just tweaks on old ideas. And in some cases, they're used to sell complete bullshit, like from the very top of SpaceX.
So you can take off from New York City or Vancouver and fly halfway across the globe. You'll be on the BFR for roughly half an hour or 40 minutes.
Then it goes out to Elon Musk fans, who absolutely lap this stuff up.
I mean, Gwen, come on, this is awesome, but it's crazy, right? Like, this is never going to actually happen.
Oh, no, it's definitely going to happen. This is definitely going to happen.
How? Like, what?
And then you get the Elon Musk fans who think that, actually, no, this really is going to happen.
Starship will be able to carry 1,000 passengers from Sydney to Dubai in just 40 minutes.
But this time we're going to do something different. We're just going to take a look at this from the perspective of fuel economy.
So even if my rocket was slightly more expensive and the fuel is a little bit more expensive, I can run 10x at least what they're running in a day and really make the revenue that I need to out of that system.
No. You see, rockets have this thing called payload fraction, which is basically how much of your rocket isn't the rocket or the fuel. And for a rocket, it's typically about 1%. So, rough breakdown is a rocket is 90-ish% fuel. 10% of the mass of the rocket is just the dry mass of the rocket, the fuel tanks and the engines, that sort of thing. And about 1% of the rocket's launch mass is what you can put into orbit. Now, the reason for this is fairly simple. To get into one of these long-range ballistic trajectories, or to go into orbit, you have to go fast. Orbital speed around the Earth is some 8 kilometers per second.
The Navy has unveiled a new secret weapon. The developers call it a railgun.
Traveling at 7 times the speed of sound, as fast as going from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia in 3 minutes.
7 times the speed of sound.
Railgun speeds are amateur hour compared to orbital velocities. They're about 2-3-ish kilometers per second. Low Earth orbit velocities about 8 kilometers per second. And for reference, the speed of sound is about 1/3 of a kilometer per second. Now sure, Elon Musk isn't suggesting that his rockets are going to go into orbit here, but to get to the other side of the planet in half an hour or so, it's not far off. Let's just look at what he's got here. Anywhere on Earth in about half an hour. So halfway around the world is about 20,000 kilometers, and they're going to do it in about half an hour. So it's about 40,000 kilometers per hour-ish. And there's about 4,000-ish seconds in an hour. So it's about 10 kilometers per second. You do basically have to get up to orbital type velocities to do this. And for those who think that I'm just doing some calculation that Elon Musk really wasn't promising, and you want to hear it straight from his mouth? Okay, there it is in his own animation, that he thinks that the maximum velocity is going to be about 27,000 kilometers per hour, versus my estimate of 40,000 kilometers per hour. Yeah, you're basically still going at orbital velocities. And therein lies the problem. It takes a crazy amount of energy, fuel, to get up to 10 kilometers per second. Because the energy goes with the square of the velocity. So a plane traveling at about the speed of sound has about 1,000 times less energy than one of these rockets. And you have to put all of that energy to get that velocity into the rocket in the fuel burn, which takes a couple of minutes or so. And then you've got to lose all of that velocity again, that same amount of energy as burning all of that fuel. And you've got to dissipate that during re-entry.
Orion now at an altitude of 470,000 feet, 900 miles from its splashdown target. Guidance officer confirms that Orion has reached entry interface. The moment of truth for Orion for the next 9 minutes 45 seconds. And as expected, we have reached a loss of telemetry as we enter this brief blackout period. This is the point in time where Orion would be experiencing its peak heating, traveling about 20,000 miles an hour, some 84% of the velocity of a spacecraft returning from the moon. We're 4 minutes away from the jettison of the forward bay cover at the very top of the spacecraft that will begin the chute deployment sequence.
Now, in the meanwhile, the plane is flying through the viscous atmosphere. These people are fairly smart, so they fly above about 3/4 of the atmosphere, where about 3/4 of the viscosity of the air has gone. Now, Starship says it can take about 100 tons to low Earth orbit. The dry mass of the first stage is about 180 tons, and the second stage is about 120 tons. The propellant weight for the first stage is about 3,500 tons. And for the second, about 1,200 tons. So the total propellant weight is about 4,500 tons, that sort of thing.
In other words, in the same time that it takes one Airbus A380 to travel from Sydney to Dubai, Starship can transport over 20 Airbus A380s worth of passengers between the two locations.
Cool, so rough size comparisons. The Starship is about 50 meters in length, while the A380 that this guy wants to do the comparison with is about 70. So these are approximately on the same scale, and immediately you start to see the problems. Airbus has about 4 to 5 times more space to put passengers in as the rocket. Now, the entire mass of the rocket is about 300 tons, which is very comparable to the mass of the Airbus, which is about 270 tons-ish. And its maximum takeoff weight is about 580 tons. Carries about 600 passengers at about, let's say, 100 kilos per piece. Yeah, it's like 80 kilos for the human and 20-odd kilos for the luggage. So that's going to be about 60 tons of people on this plane. So it's about 280 tons is just the dry mass of the plane, 60 tons of people, that's 340 tons in total, which means with a full loadout of fuel, it's about 240 tons of fuel, and that will take you halfway round the world. So Elon Musk's rocket, right, it's going to take 100 tons of cargo. So let's be super generous and say 1,000 people. Although even Elon Musk's most devoted fans have to wince kind of hard at the idea of about half of the weight of the rocket that's landing being constituted of people.
Starship will be able to carry 1,000 passengers from Sydney to Dubai in just 40 minutes.
Yeah, it turns out this guy was talking complete crap when he says 1,000 people. Elon Musk and their PR people say more like 100 people.
The first BFR is going to have roughly 100 passengers.
But just for an easy comparison, let's say that the Starship can carry a similar number of passengers to the Airbus. So the fuel requirements for the Airbus are about 250 tons of fossil fuel. Propellant requirements for the rocket is about 4,500 tons. Now, to be fair, about 4/5 of that mass is going to be liquid oxygen, which is not a fossil fuel. Not free either, but we'll come back to that later. So it turns out about 20% of this fuel on this rocket is a fossil fuel, methane. So it's about 1,000 tons of fossil fuel for one of these rocket trips compared to about 250 tons for the plane. So straight out of the bag, it's 4 times as much fuel to carry a similar number of passengers. Except if you take SpaceX's numbers, they're only going to take 1/6 of the number of passengers. So that means it has about 25 times a higher carbon footprint than the plane. Hardly a great selling point. And now you're going to make up for that by flying these rockets 10 times a day, and you're going to really make up the revenue that way.
But if you think about it, if I can do this trip in half an hour to an hour, I can do dozens of these a day, right? And yet a long-haul aircraft can only make one of those flights a day. So even if my rocket was slightly more expensive and the fuel is a little bit more expensive, I can run 10x at least what they're running in a day and really make the revenue that I need to out of that system.
Oh, and precious. What comes out today but Elon Musk offering $100 million for carbon capture technology? Well, yeah, maybe the best solution would be to not take as many long-distance trips. And if you do have to take long-distance trips, don't take one that burns 4 times as much fuel, and don't take one from a company that is running those fuel-burning parties 10 times as fast as planes do. Now, I should stress, these numbers aren't going to get any better because fundamentally, rocket engines are some of the most efficient on the market. And even if you bump these rocket engine efficiencies from, say, 70% to 100%, making them perfectly efficient, it's not going to change the overall conclusion here, because the principal problem is an intrinsic one, that within a few minutes you have to burn enough fuel to accelerate the bodies of your passengers up to some 30 times the speed of sound, a velocity that make railguns seem like kids' toys. Then you've got to lose that exact same amount of energy again on the re-entry. Honestly, looked at like this, I'm stunned that launch success rates are as high as they currently are. Even the everyday astronaut who I first came across doing a truly horrific video where he was gushing praise on Elon Musk's idea of putting cold gas thrusters on a car. No. Even when he is posed with a question, would he get on board one of Elon Musk's rocket ships without an emergency abort system? He says...
So I guess the question should be, would I ride on Starship without an abort system? For now, the answer is no. I think we should see at least a few dozen flights without crew first. We should find the limits and the boundaries, maybe have some failures or two, and only once we've seen Starship fly 10 plus times reliably without any failures would I consider getting on one.
Anyway, on his video about does Starship need an abort system, he does okay, but constantly and looks through rose-coloured glasses in playing down the need for an abort system.
From the 90s on, only one launch out of 180-ish launches required a launch abort system actually be used. So only about 0.5% of flights would see any benefit from a launch escape system at all.
And for me, well, yeah, that's worth it. I mean, especially if you're going to go down this, we're going to fly Starship-like planes thing. I mean, if their rockets carry 100 or so people...
The first BFR is going to have roughly 100 passengers.
And you're going to get about 1% on average dying. That means, on average, one person on every flight with Starship would die. He also includes this clip of Elon Musk saying, "What's the best design for a rocket?
The best part is no part. The best process is no process. It weighs nothing, costs nothing, can't go wrong."
Cool. So simple is better. So a simple solution for a business meeting with someone on the other side of the world would be a Zoom call or something. A massively overcomplicated solution would be to fly fuel-guzzling rockets at 10 kilometers per second for a short meeting on the other side of the planet, then fly home again, 'cause reasons.
How did you end up an engineer and president of SpaceX?
And I would love to get to see my customers in Riyadh leave in the morning and be back in time to make dinner.
The best part is no part. Like the thing I'm most impressed with when I have the design meetings at SpaceX is what did you undesign?
But on the subject of simpler is better, you know, like say for instance having 2 engines or 40. It's when you look at the bottom of the SpaceX booster, you just got to think, really, how much plumbing is involved in getting the propellant into the engines there? And maintenance, I mean, it's bad enough to maintain the 2 or 4 engines on a plane. This looks like a nightmare. Now, you might be wondering why people just spam engines like this at all. Well, that's just a historic thing that rocket engines take forever to design and get them working properly. So when you're building your rockets, they tend to be just built around whatever rocket engines you're comfortable you can make. And SpaceX have the rocket engines they're comfortable they can make, so you just spam those. Now, it's got to be said that rocketry is a pretty mature field. People have been making these engines like this for the best part of 100 years. Yeah, I'm pretty comfortable with my prejudices here that the reason that we don't have reliable rocket engines is not because rocket engineers have been sitting around for the last 50 years just sort of saying, yeah, 1 or 2% failure rate is fine, until Elon Musk comes along and says, wow, wouldn't it be great if we could make rocket engines 1,000 times more reliable? But anyway, I decided to get a second opinion on this, and I went to Scott Manley. Not only because he's got one of the most awesome names online, but I've also never really seen him put a foot wrong. So this is what he says. I think orbital launch success rate will rise very slowly because there are new organizations getting into the launch business, and that will bring the number down, while established launch providers trend towards their baseline reliability. And this was in response to how much higher do you think the number's going to get, the launch reliability in the next 10 to 20 years, orders of magnitude-ish. Yeah, very slowly seems to be where he was going with that. But Twitter, maybe not the best way to communicate this sort of thing. Then, of course, you have the dewy-eyed optimism.
The answer to what can we do to make rockets more reliable is simple. Fly them more often. Fly reusable rockets over and over instead of throwing them away. Only then will we begin to get anywhere near airliner-like reliability.
Well, I'm not even entirely sure about that, but I mean, maybe the real problem is, to what end? You only need half a dozen or so flights to the International Space Station per year. Or what? So you can fly rockets such that Elon Musk's collaborators can be home in time for tea. No one is going to pay 10 times what a plane costs for what is realistically going to be a 1 in 100 chance of dying. And taking people to Mars is that on steroids. I mean, I did a video about what going to live on Mars would be like. And to keep with Elon Musk's idea, of deleting the redundant stuff, you can get all of the experience of going to Mars by finding an uninhabited cave and living the rest of your life in it.
No, your probability of dying on Mars is much higher than Earth.
That's pretty much what life on Mars will be like.
It's going to be hard. There's a good chance of death. Going in a little can through deep space. You might land successfully.
Sadly, this ain't me being Debbie Downer either. This is Captain Reality paying a visit. I mean, even if Elon Musk can somehow get it all to work and actually ship people to Mars.
Once you land successfully, there will be you'll be working non-stop to build the base.
Once people get there, and the truly horrific quality of life on Mars becomes widely known.
And once you get there, even after doing all this, it's a very harsh environment, so there's a good chance you die there.
No one else will go, let alone pay Elon Musk millions of dollars for the experience. I mean, if you want to do this properly, try sending some robots to Mars first to build a stable human habitat. And if you can do that, then we'll talk about putting some humans into the aquarium. I mean, all I can really do is leave you with some criticisms of the last reusable space vehicle. And you'll see that, even people who do this routinely can still have blind spots to just how dangerous this can be. Young and Ross were among the astronauts who believed that the shuttle was always an experimental craft, not an operational vehicle for routine spaceflight, as President Ronald Reagan declared after STS-4. Hawke said in 2017 that before STS-1 he saw an analysis estimating the risk of loss of the vehicle as 1 in 280, but an internal NASA risk assessment study released in late 2010 concluded that the agency had seriously underestimated the level of risk involved in operating the shuttle. The report assessed that there was a 1 in 9 chance of a catastrophic disaster during the first 9 flights of the shuttle, but the safety improvements had later improved the risk ratio to 1 in 90. In 1984, Reagan signed a directive stating that the shuttle would not be fully operational until it could fly 24 missions per year, perhaps by 1988. It's a while ago now, and in the end it averaged out at about 6 per year. Although many astronauts criticized the Payload Specialist program, in part because they did not believe that less trained outsiders were fully aware of the risks of spaceflight, full-time astronauts may not have been either. Bolden was amazed to learn after the loss of Columbia that the impenetrable leading edges of the vehicle he flew for 14 years were less than an inch thick. Hawke, with much experience flying dangerous craft at the United States Naval Test Pilot School, said, "If I knew in advance that 1 in 25 would fail, I would probably think twice about flying 3, as I did, out of the first 26 flights." Yeah, something tells me that Starship's not going to be squashing long-haul aviation. So, yep, that's today's video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a thumbs up on it. If you don't want to miss out on more videos like this, make sure you hit subscribe. And as ever, if you really like the work of this channel, you can support it directly through Patreon. And thanks for watching.